Before using any machine in the shop, you should read and understand the owner's manuals.
Today we're going to take a look at our bandsaw. And our bandsaw is a linear saw, meaning that the blade moves in a line direction. So if we look at the blade here, the blade is a straight line that when it's cutting at the cutting point is moving straight down into the table. It's not like a circular saw where the blade is spinning in a circular pattern. All right, so when we talk about a bandsaw, we open up the inside and the blade makes one band. It's one big metal band around the entire saw. So there's an upper wheel and a lower wheel down below, and these wheels are what guide the cut. So within this wheel, there's a little rubber tire that fits on the wheel, and this blade just rides on that tire. So the only thing keeping this here is pressure against those two wheels. That's what gives the blade its tension. And so what we mean by a bandsaw again is that it's a metal band that goes around these wheels, and that's what it gets the name bandsaw. While we have this compartment open in here, you'll also notice up here on the door, that's where the warning labels are for this machine. Of course, we want this unplugged anytime that we're opening up the compartment to make sure that nobody gets accidentally injured. So we'll go ahead and tighten that back up and shut that down. Now we look at this blade. The blade is not very big. So the blade doesn't have very much depth to it. So it's just a small little, this one's about 3/4 of an inch, maybe 1/2 inch. And so it can move quite easily on us. As we're cutting, this blade could flex and bend. So we want this guide wheel to be as close to the table as possible so that this blade does not flex and move on us as much, because the guide and guard is as close as possible. So we want this distance here underneath to be as close as possible without hitting. So I've got this board that we're going to use to cut. So we're going to get this set for what we need. We want the distance between this guide block and our workpiece to be 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch. So pretty much we're saying as close as possible without touching. So we're going to use our adjustments, our knobs, to turn these. So if we look up top, we have this adjustment handle on the side. This adjustment handle is what lowers and raises the blade. Before we use that, we need to loosen the locking nut or the locking bolt that holds that in place. So we loosen that, then we can rotate this, and as we rotate, you'll notice that that is moving up and down according to where we want it. Okay, and so we're looking for about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch. So as we're sitting here looking, we're going to try to have as minimal as possible between there. Let's see if we can get this fine-tuned here. Once we get it about where we think is good, okay, we're going to come back up to our handles and lock them in place. So we stop turning, we come over here to the locking nut or bolt and tighten that up. Okay, it doesn't have to be Superman tight, just tight enough so that it doesn't work loose and vibrate loose as we're cutting. So we see this other handle back here while we're looking, and this wheel here. So these are adjustments for the blade tension and the blade tracking. So typically you shouldn't need to adjust those unless I ask you to change a blade. And even that, if I ask you to change a blade, I would probably come back through and check the alignment and tension on the blade before we start using it. So really shouldn't need to mess with these items in the center of the saw on the back side. So once we've got the blade guard and guide set, we're going to take our workpiece and just make sure that it moves freely without hitting anything underneath that guard or guide. So again, that should only be about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch above the workpiece. Just enough so we can clear it and not hit anything. Now when we're cutting our work pieces, a couple things we need to talk about. we're cutting our workpieces, we should have two hands on the workpiece, okay? We can kind of think about that as one hand kind of pushing forward and the other hand is maybe guiding or making our radius cuts. Since we're using the bandsaw and it's got that thin blade, we're not going to be able to get very straight cuts. Our cuts are going to be more irregular shape, maybe for cutting out radiuses or just very quickly cutting something off the workpiece. But really it's not going to be used to get two parallel lines or cuts like you would get on a table saw. Now we've made sure that we cleared underneath the guard, so that's good. We're going to use two hands on the board and one on each side or both on the same side depending on how much material you have on each side. We don't want our hand to be directly in line with the blade, because if I'm pushing and something happens, it binds and my hand slips, I'm going into the blade. You notice that there is a little bit of exposed blade there. There's not really an ideal way to guard that blade. So we just have to be cautious of that and keep your hands a safe distance. Just like our other machines, this one has a miter track. The miter track is a good reference point that our hands should not be any closer to the blade than the miter track. The miter track will fit a miter gauge for your convenience. And also we have this fence that we can use for cutting, trying to get more parallel or straight cuts. Or maybe you have some pieces that you're trying to get a whole bunch the same size. And we could set this as a stop or a guide for cutting multiple pieces. But even with the fence, we're not going to get very straight cuts with this bandsaw. So with this machine, we're likely going to be doing irregular shapes. If we're going to cut a radius on here and we have our shape or line drawn on here and we're going to make this cut, we have to be careful that the blade does not touch in two spots at the same time. So as we're turning, we've got to make sure we have enough room for the blade to make the radius. So the blade is kind of this line shape, and if the front of the blade where the teeth are start to turn too fast and the back of the blade here touches, so if the front of the blade is turning, the back of the blade is touching both sides of the material, we're going to bind or pinch the blade. And so if we bind or pinch the blade, we have some hazards that it could come off of the wheels or the blade could break. And so we got to be careful that we don't pinch the blade. So one way we can help relieve some of that pressure is with relief cuts. And so relief cuts would be a series of straight cuts coming in that would relieve the pressure as we're cutting. So we wouldn't cut all the way to the line like this one. This is a bad example. But as we're cutting, then we make this cut, and as we start to turn tighter, these pieces would be falling away. So all these straight lines would be here. You would come and cut, and then as you got to this point, this little wedge here would fall away. Then as you got to this one, this little piece would fall away. And so these relief cuts would relieve the pressure as we're making our cuts, and they would all just kind of fall away as you're making your cuts, as you pass them. So relief cuts are what we want to do if we're making a radius that is too tight for the blade, where we might pinch the blade. If we're ever in a point where we get stuck in the middle of a cut and we can't move the blade or move our workpiece, say we're in the middle of a cut and we get stuck, something goes wrong, we're hitting something, maybe a little chunk is bound down there between the blade. So what you would want to do is turn the machine off, wait for it to come to a complete stop, then take something like your pencil or pen or block of wood, and of course we want to make sure it's unplugged when we're doing this, and you would push against the blade to keep the pressure on the blade, and then you could just slowly back out your workpiece. Without this pressure on the blade, we run the risk of pulling the blade off of the wheels. You remember I showed you just a minute ago, the wheels up top, the only thing keeping them there is pressure and that rubber tire. So if we pull too hard, we could pull it right off. Now we don't have that same problem when pushing, because this support block has a little graphite or a little ceramic guide in the back that keeps the pressure tight against there. So as I'm pushing, the blade's only going to move so far, and then it's supported by that back piece. If I am pulling back, there's nothing supported on the front, and that could come out and cause problems. So we want to make sure anytime you're backing out of a cut with the machine off that you use that your pen or pencil or wood to back that out for safety against the blade. As we're cutting, we're probably going to get some pieces, if we're making multiple cuts, that are going to start stacking up on the back side of the blade. These little fall off pieces, if you're cutting multiple pieces, you're going to have them fall off and sit next to the blade. If you have little pieces next to the blade, your next piece when you cut is going to push that out of the way. Now, if you have a whole bunch of pieces on the back side, they should eventually fall off the table onto the floor. What we never want to do is reach around this moving blade. So if this blade is moving and the machine is on and plugged in, we don't want to reach around the blade to remove those pieces either side, okay? If you need to get back there, maybe you got a long piece you don't want to hit the floor because it's good, you need to walk to the back side of the machine, and then you could securely grab that piece and support it. Don't reach around the moving blade. Over here at the side, we have our on-off switch and emergency stop. So sometimes when you go to turn that on, that emergency stop has been pushed in. And so to turn it out, all you do is quarter turn and it should pop or spring back out, and then we're ready to go. Once that is out, then you can hit the green button to go or red button to shut off. When you're cutting in the middle of a cut and you're ready to stop, you can hit the small red button or the big red button. Either one, it doesn't matter. Just know that if you use the big one, you're going to have to unturn it and pop it out each time. This machine is also equipped with a brake. So down here in the operator's position, there's a little foot pedal or brake right here. My foot is on it. We should only be using that in emergency situations. That brake would wear out over time, just like the brakes on your car, and would need to be replaced if we use it unnecessarily. So really, we're using it for emergency situations. If something goes wrong, you step on the brake. Once you hit that brake, it not only stops the blade, but it will also turn the power off to the machine. So as it's running and you turn that, you hit that pedal, it shuts the power off, and you need to keep your foot on the pedal until it comes to a complete stop. When we talk about bandsaw and safety, the hazardous position to stand in when using the machine would be over here to the right. And the right of the machine is a hazard because if this blade were to break, it's pretty flexible from right to left. And if it were to hit the table, it's going to move right or left because that's how it's flexible. And if it shoots out to the right, it's going to hit you or a bystander watching the machine. So if somebody's standing around watching you, they shouldn't be standing right next to the machine here. If the blade hits the table when it breaks and shoots out to the left, it's going to hit the side of the machine over here. And so there's not quite the hazard there is to standing to the right side of the machine. So before we make our cut, just like our other machines, we need to make sure that the cord is in good condition, the prongs are all there that need to be, and that there's no breaks or abrasions in the cord leading up to the machine. Once you've checked out the cord, you can go ahead and plug it in. Once you've plugged it in, we can turn the machine on by using the green button for go. So I'm going to turn this machine on, let it get to full speed. I'm going to show you what the emergency brake does. So we'll turn it on. The machine is running. And if I hit the emergency brake down below, it's going to turn the machine off. And if I push down, it's going to stop it very quickly. So that is there for emergency situations. Please do not use that for everyday use. We want it to be in good condition when you need it. Now, let's show you another option for turning off the machine. And so that is going to be Let's turn it back on with the green button, and you can shut it off with this big knob here. So we turn it on, let it get to full speed. If we push that in, it stops on its own. Most bandsaws take a long time to stop. There's no electric brake. And with this machine being so quiet, we want to make sure we stay here until we visually see the blade stop moving. We don't want to accidentally think that we turned it off, then walk away, and maybe you didn't accidentally hit the off button. And now somebody comes walking by and trips and falls into the blade. Once we get going with the dust system and the other machines running, this machine, you're not going to be able to really hear it while it's running. So we got to make sure we stay at the machine until it comes to a complete stop. All right, we're going to make our cut. For today, we're just going to make a simple cut. I'm going to draw a pattern to follow. Now, typically, when you're cutting, you're not going to cut the line, but you would cut on the waist side. So we would stay about a 1/16 of an inch to the waist side of our good line. This is going to allow us to come in later on and sand this up so that we get rid of any saw blade marks or things like that. So let's turn it on and make this cut. We'll let it get to full speed. We're going to be on one side of the board, and we're going to make our cut. So if we make another cut, that piece that's stuck there is going to move itself out of the way. So if we do that again, all right, the problem we run into is when we get little tiny pieces. That little tiny piece has a potential of getting stuck down in the throat plate. So let's turn this off, and we'll wait for it to come to a complete stop. What we don't want to do is we never want to take a board and stick it in there to slow it down. We're not going to jam a board into a blade to get it to stop faster. Okay, that's not a safe practice. We're just going to patiently wait for that to come to a complete stop. So now, because the power is still connected, I don't want to reach my hands in there if somebody accidentally bumps the switch. Maybe it's a faulty switch and it turns on. So I would want to use my workpiece to push that out of there and get any scrap materials out. Again, if we need to reach around, we would come around to the back side of the blade. We could grab our scrap piece and then get those out of the way. So it's these little pieces like this that are going to cause you problems. What could happen is they can get stuck down right next to the blade and kind of get pinched in there. And then it's going to rub and create all kinds of friction. And when you go to push, your workpiece is going to get stuck on that little wedge rather than smoothly or clearly going over that. So that's why we need to make sure we shut things off. We clean things off when we're done to make sure those little pieces don't get stuck in there. When we're done using the machine, we're going to come in and clean it up. And so we're going to use a hand broom. Don't use your bare hand on the steel surfaces. If there was a little nick or a burr on the metal or little chunks of sawdust, they could give you slivers. So we're going to use the hand broom to clean off any excess dust on the machine. You could use air, whether that's blowing on it with your mouth or some compressed air. Really, we try to avoid using compressed air to blow sawdust because that just puts more dust particles in the air for us to breathe. So we could take the dust system and vacuum it off, or we could just use our broom and sweep it all down and clean it. So we're going to take a big block like this, and let's say we want to cut the corners off so it fits better on the lathe. Maybe we want to do like 45 there, 45 there, 45 there, 45 there. That way we don't have these corners to deal with on the lathe. And so how we would do that is we're going to need to raise this guard up so that we can have a room to work. So we'll come around to the back side. We're going to loosen the locking handle, and then we're going to spin the other handle until we raise up and give ourselves some clearance. So now if we're going to go under the table here, we're going to show you how to adjust or bevel the table. So underneath here, we're going to find ourselves some locking handles. This first one is what we use to change the blade. So this gives us access to the center of the table to feed a new band through the table. We don't need that one. We need this one up front. This is going to release the lock so that we can pivot the table on these little cams here. There's one in front and one in back. So I'm going to release that and release this side. We can tilt it to where we want it to be, and then lock those same locking levers under the table to keep it in place. So the table does bevel for cutting angles. Never should we hold our workpiece at the angle when we're cutting. So let's put this table back. Again, those locking levers underneath. When we set it back down, we could always check for squareness with the blade with a speed square. There should be a default setting on the saw, so when it hits the base under here, that it's in the correct position. Let's take a look and see if we can locate that. Under the saw, we're taking a look for that little block where you might check your angle. So right here is a stop. When we put this table back down and this nut or bolt is sitting on this base of the machine, that should be 90 degrees. Okay, but we don't ever want to take a chance with that. We should always check it. I would recommend getting your speed square and checking that against the blade to make sure the table's 90 degrees. So I've raised this blade guard up. I've got my speed square here against the blade, trying to determine if that is truly 90 degrees. If it is 90 degrees, or if it needs an adjustment, we can adjust it and then use those locking handles underneath the table to lock that in its correct position. So if this was for a good project, then we would want to make sure that that is 90 degrees before you make any cuts. If you're just cutting some scrap pieces and there's a little angle on the table, that might not make a big deal for your project. But if this is a good piece for the project, then we need to make sure that it is 90 degrees. So now that I've moved that speed square out of the way, you can see this blade guard is really high. And so if I'm cutting this thin little piece of wood down here and I have all this blade exposed, if my hand were to slip, that's a lot of cutting surface that I am now exposed to and have a danger of losing a finger or an arm. So we want to make sure that this guard and guide is down as low as possible without hitting the wood. And typically we say that's 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch above the workpiece. So to loosen or move that, we're going to come around to the back side. We're going to undo the little locking knob here, and then we're going to spin the handle to raise or lower that guide to where you want it. So the blade guide and blade guard, lower that to where you want it. Once it's in the right place or right location, right height, then that's when you would come back after you check that and then lock the size in so it doesn't move or vibrate loose. So when we're getting ready to make our cuts, we need to have our hands positioned so they're away from the blade. We never want our hand to be directly in line with the blade or pushing directly in line with the blade, because if it slips, our hand slips, it's going to go right towards some exposed blade there. So we typically have our hands either one on each side of the workpiece or both hands on the same side to guide our cut. Again, one is kind of pushing through and the other is kind of guiding or twisting our angles as we're cutting, or our radiuses. So on our bandsaw, again, we need to follow the 4-inch margin of safety. And there's times that when we're cutting little pieces for our pen projects. Now, if I were to cut this, my hand is way too close. I'm over the miter track, so that's a good indicator. Plus, it's so small, that should be just indication enough for you in your mind that that is not going to be a safe cut. My hands would be way too close. If something were to go wrong, I don't have enough time to react. So how can we cut small pieces? We can take our wooden twist clamp or our hand screw clamp here, and we can position this so that it's holding on to the workpiece. We can make our cut safely by holding onto the clamp, and now my hand is a safe distance away from the cutter to cut some smaller pieces. We want to make sure it's in there nice and tight. And remember, with these clamps, the jaws need to be parallel with each other. This clamp works good because if something were to go wrong, it's wood that we're cutting. We're not cutting into a metal clamp or a plastic that could cause problems. With the bandsaw, we're typically not using our push stick on this machine. Our hands are doing the work. We can't just simply push through like we would on the table saw because of that guard and guide are in the way. But the push stick may come in handy at times if there's something that you need to get out of the way while the machine is plugged in. Again, we shouldn't be removing these scraps while it's running, but if it's plugged in and you just have power to it and you don't want to get your hands that close, then that's where the push stick or a scrap piece of wood would come into play on the bandsaw. When we come up to the bandsaw, we don't want to assume that it's set up for our needs. If somebody was using this before us, we want to make sure the guide and guard is set to the right height. We'd maybe want to make sure the table is at 90 degrees and the fence is at your right location if you're going to use the fence. Again, don't ever assume that any of the machines in the shop are set up for what you need. You want to be able to set them up and make sure they're accurate for your specific process. If you have any questions with regards to this machine or any other machine in the shop, please talk to your instructor so we can get those questions answered and you will be comfortable and have the knowledge to use this machine safely.